Back in 2021, after a year of working from home due to the pandemic, my company was bought out by a private equity firm. We all knew changes were coming, but no one was prepared for how quickly it happened. Within a few months, they laid off a lot of good people, including our CEO, Tom. Tom was eccentric for sure. He was the type who wore Hawaiian shirts and called everyone by nicknames he made up on the spot. He wasn't everyone's favorite, but he cared about the company and its people. Most of us respected him for that. His replacement was named Joanna. She was in her late 20s and had just graduated with an MBA. A lot of us didn't know what to think when she was introduced. She was polite, but seemed nervous, and I got the feeling that she was out of her depth. Some said she had been handpicked by the private equity firm because she'd worked cheaply. I didn't think much of it at the time, because rumors like that flew around every time there were big changes. It didn't take long to see the cracks forming with her, though. Joanna struggled to connect with people. Most of my coworkers had been with the company for years, and they weren't thrilled about taking orders from someone who was younger than their kids. She wasn't confident in her role, and it showed. Meetings became tense, with a lot of people making passive-aggressive comments after she was gone. I didn't have to interact with Joanna much, because I worked in a department that didn't need that much direct oversight, but even from a distance, I could tell she was having a hard time. I started to feel sorry for her, but only to a point. She'd taken the job knowing what it involved. Every decision she made felt rushed, and instead of explaining her reasoning, she'd shut down questions with short, defensive answers. It was clear she was overwhelmed, but it wasn't my problem, at least not yet. As time went on, it all became harder to ignore. She often clashed with senior staff, many of whom had spent decades building the company. What bothered people the most wasn't her age or inexperience, it was her attitude. She acted like every question or suggestion was a personal attack. That insecurity made it hard to work with her, and the tension only grew worse. Some of my coworkers started keeping notes on her mistakes, saying it was only a matter of time before she was let go. Others avoided her altogether, but it felt like the whole office was walking on eggshells. I wasn't directly under Joanna, but I did have a few interactions with her, and they were always awkward. She had a way of making even the smallest conversations uncomfortable, like she didn't trust anyone's intentions. One day, after a particularly heated meeting, she asked to speak with me privately. I didn't think much of it and followed her to a conference room. She asked about a project my team was working on, and I explained our progress. But then she started asking why we hadn't met a deadline that hadn't even been finalized yet. I tried to explain, but she kept interrupting and said that we needed to do better. Her tone grew sharper with every sentence, and I could feel my patience wearing thin. I told her that I couldn't fix problems I didn't know about. Then I suggested that she communicate more clearly. It was a snarky comment, I can admit that, but I was frustrated. That's when she snapped. She started yelling and even got in my face at one point. She started raising her voice, and I could tell she was on the verge of losing control. Then out of nowhere, she grabbed a stapler off the table and hit herself in the head with it. Blood started dripping down her cheek, and I just stared at her. I was confused for a bit, but then she started yelling that I'd attacked her. Then people started gathering outside the conference room. I tried to stay calm and explain that I hadn't touched her, but she kept insisting that I'd assaulted her with the stapler. I knew how bad this looked, and it was her word against mine. I started wondering if I'd need a lawyer. Thankfully, the company had recently installed security cameras in the conference rooms, so although Joanna didn't know, the entire incident had been recorded. When HR reviewed the footage, it was obvious that she'd hit herself and fabricated the story about me. The relief I felt is hard to describe. I'd been terrified that my career and reputation could be destroyed by something I didn't do. Joanna was fired soon after, and I didn't see her again after that day, but I heard through the grapevine that the new owners had quietly removed her from their roster of hires. It was clear she needed help, and while I was angry about what she'd put me through, I couldn't bring myself to hold a grudge. This happened at my first job out of college. I had a degree in art history, which, as you might imagine, didn't exactly open up a lot of career doors. So after a long job search, I ended up taking an internship at an advertising firm. The office was on one of the upper floors of a big downtown building, and walking in on my first day felt intimidating. Everyone seemed so polished and professional, and I was just a kid with an unrelated degree and barely any work experience. My first impression of the place was that it moved fast, people rushed to meetings, and they were all talking in terms that I didn't fully understand yet. My boss was a guy named Steve. He was young, probably barely 30 if I had to guess, and he had the kind of confidence that made him seem older. However, right from the beginning, Steve was cold towards me. He didn't smile or introduce himself when I was brought to his team. Instead, he barely looked up from his desk when I first arrived. At first, I thought maybe I'd done something wrong, but it turned out that's just how he was. People told me he wasn't much friendlier with them, so I tried not to take it personally. Everyone else in the office was polite, but I didn't have much in common with them. Most were busy and didn't pay me much attention, which was fine, because I was more focused on figuring out how things worked. The intern tasks weren't glamorous. I ran errands, organized files, and spent a lot of time reading through campaign briefs without understanding half of what was in them. I learned quickly, though, and I started to enjoy seeing how campaigns came together. The work was fast-paced, and I liked that, but Steve's attitude stayed the same. If I asked a question, he'd give me a short answer, or worse, he'd say nothing at all. He wasn't outright mean, but his indifference stung. People respected Steve because he was good at his job. His campaigns always performed well, and he was good at pitching ideas in meetings. But there were rumors about how he treated people, and I wasn't the only one who felt like he was impossible to approach. Despite his coldness, I couldn't help but admire his talent. At the time, that mattered more to me than anything else. I wanted to learn, and if that meant dealing with a boss who barely acknowledged me, then so be it. Eventually, I started noticing small things about Steve's routine. He was meticulous about his workspace, keeping everything in order. He drank an almost comical amount of coffee, often pacing with a mug in hand around his desk. Occasionally, I'd overhear his conversations with clients or upper management, and I was always impressed by how he handled himself. But outside of those moments, he seemed closed off, like he didn't want anyone to know much about him. It was a strange contrast. He was brilliant and composed in front of others, but detached with our team. I wondered if it was just stress. Advertising seemed like a high-pressure industry, and Steve carried more responsibility than most. Maybe he just didn't have the bandwidth to be friendly, but whatever the reason, I kept my head down and tried to absorb as much as I could. Things started changing about 3 months into my internship. Steve began showing up to the office late, which was unusual for him because he'd always been one of the first people in before. At first it wasn't that bad. He'd come in just a little later than usual, looking a bit tired, but it quickly got worse. He started arriving hours late, unshaven and wearing wrinkled clothes. People noticed and rumors spread through the office. No one knew what was going on, but it was clear that something was wrong. Steve's work started to slip too. His meetings became scattered, and he missed a couple of deadlines, which was unheard of for him. Upper management took notice and pulled him aside for a conversation. I overheard bits and pieces from people who sat near the manager's office. They'd suggested he take some time off to deal with whatever was going on, but Steve refused. He insisted that he was fine and could handle his workload, but it was obvious to everyone that he wasn't. The turning point came one morning when Steve showed up drunk. I didn't notice it at first, but someone pointed it out to me later, and then it all made sense. It wasn't long before his boss confronted him. The conversation was loud enough for half the office to hear. Steve was shouting about how he didn't need anyone's help, and that he'd been working harder than anyone else in the company. His boss tried to stay calm, but Steve wouldn't back down. Finally, he was told that he'd be fired if he didn't leave the office immediately. Steve refused, and then things escalated quickly. Someone called security, but by the time they arrived, the situation had gotten worse. Steve was yelling incoherently and pacing around the office. When the police showed up, he became even more aggressive. They started taking him out, but then he reached for the officer's gun. Thankfully, they restrained him before anything terrible happened, but it was a frightening scene. The whole office was in shock. Over the next few days, people were talking about what had led to Steve's breakdown. Some thought it was personal issues, while others speculated about addiction. Management was quick to reassure everyone that things were under control, but the mood in the office remained tense for weeks afterwards. Then the company sent out an email explaining that Steve was no longer with the firm. I thought that would be the end of it, but later that year, I saw Steve again. It was late at night, close to midnight, and I was on the bus heading home after staying late at the office. The bus was nearly empty, and as I found a seat near the back, I noticed someone sitting a few rows ahead. It took me a moment to recognize him. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the few months since I'd last seen him. His clothes were dirty, and he had the hollow look of someone who hadn't slept in a while. I debated whether to say something, but decided against it. He didn't seem to notice me, or maybe he was pretending not to. I felt a pang of guilt as I got off the bus at my stop. I couldn't stop wondering what had happened to him, and whether he had anyone in his life to help him. Seeing him like that stayed with me for a long time. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control, and how important it was to take care of yourself. Over time, I heard bits and pieces about him through old coworkers. Apparently, he'd struggled with addiction and was trying to get back on his feet. Some said he'd moved to a different city to start over, but nobody seemed to know for sure. I never saw him again after that night on the bus, but I truly do wish the best for him. "5 years ago, when I was 18, I got an interview at a restaurant near my old high school. I had just graduated and needed a job badly. My parents kept reminding me that I couldn't just sit around all summer, and they were right. My savings were almost gone, and I didn't want to rely on them for pocket money. So when I saw a help wanted sign at a small diner I passed every day, I decided to pass them a resume. The manager's name was Daryl, and he called me the same day that I submitted my application. His voice on the phone sounded a bit off, low and almost slurred, but I chalked it up to him being tired, or maybe just having a rough day, so I agreed to come by that afternoon. When I arrived, the place wasn't busy, but it wasn't completely empty either. A waitress led me to a cramped office in the back, where Daryl was waiting. He was around 30 years old, and thin to the point of looking unhealthy. He also had a patchy beard and sunken eyes. His clothes didn't fit well, his shirt was too big, and hung loosely around his shoulders. To add to it, his posture made him look like he was folding in on himself. When he shook my hand, it felt clammy, and his grip was weak. The interview itself was straightforward. Daryl asked about my availability, if I had any experience in customer service, and whether I'd be comfortable working weekends. I told him I'd never worked before, but was eager to learn and willing to take any shifts available. He nodded, though his attention seemed to wander. His eyes darted around the room, and he kept fidgeting with a pen on his desk. At one point, he mumbled something I didn't quite catch. I didn't ask him to repeat it. Instead, I focused on answering his questions as clearly as I could. Toward the end, he leaned back in his chair and said,
"Honestly, nobody else who's applied has any experience either. You're probably the best candidate so far."
It wasn't exactly a glowing endorsement, but I took it as a good sign. He handed me a form to fill out and asked for my personal information. I put in my bank details for direct deposit, my full name, and my current address. I hesitated briefly, but then I reminded myself that this was normal for a job application. When I finished the form, I handed it back to him. When I left the diner, I felt relieved. It wasn't my dream job, but at least I had something. As I walked home, though, I had a strange feeling about Daryl. Something about him had seemed off. Maybe it was the way he avoided eye contact, or the way he smiled when he handed me the form. I needed this job, though, and I couldn't afford to let a weird vibe scare me away. I didn't have much to do that night, so I went to bed early. My room was on the ground floor, and the window faced a side yard enclosed by a wooden fence. We were in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and I had lived there my whole life, without any sort of break-in. But that night, I woke up hearing noises from outside. It was late, probably around 3 a.m., and the house was completely dark. At first I thought the sound might have been nothing, but then I heard it again. It was like someone was trying to open the window. I sat up and stayed still for a moment, straining to hear. The noise came again, and this time I was sure it was a person outside. I slid out of bed quietly and moved toward the window. My heart was pounding as I peeked through the curtains. At first I couldn't make out much. It was just a shadowy figure hunched near the window. Then I heard a soft click, and the window slid open slightly. I panicked a bit and ran over to the light switch on the other side of the room. I flicked it on without thinking, but I know that I really should have gotten out of there. The sudden brightness startled the person outside, but when I got a clear look at his face, my stomach dropped. It was Daryl. His face was just inches from the screen, and for a moment, we locked eyes. His expression was a mix of surprise and panic. Then without a word, he turned and ran away, but I didn't see which way he went. I stood frozen for a moment before snapping out of it. Then I rushed to my parents' room and woke my dad. He grabbed his phone and called the police while I sat on the edge of their bed, still trying to take in what I'd seen. The police arrived and searched the yard, but Daryl was long gone. They talked to us for a bit and asked if I was sure it was him. I told them I was positive, because I'd gotten a clear look at his face. The next day, my dad decided to go to the diner and speak with the owner. He didn't tell me much before he left, just that he wanted to make sure Daryl wouldn't bother me again. When he came back, he said the conversation had been tense. The owner didn't seem surprised when my dad described what had happened. He didn't say it outright, but it was clear Daryl had a reputation for being trouble. My dad told him I wouldn't be taking the job, and the owner didn't argue. For the next few weeks, I felt on edge. Every time I heard a noise at night, I found myself holding my breath. I kept my window locked and avoided walking past the diner. Then about a month later, I heard on the news that Daryl had been arrested for armed robbery. He'd tried to hold up a liquor store and had been caught in the act. I couldn't say I was surprised. If anything, I felt relieved knowing he was off the streets. Looking back, I realized how naive I was. I didn't think twice about handing over my personal information to someone who gave me a bad feeling. It's a mistake I wouldn't make again. A few years ago, I got a job as a security guard at a warehouse. It was a temporary gig that was set to last about 3 months in total. I was in between steady work and needed something to keep me afloat, so this was good enough for a while. It came up when I was searching for work online, and the pay was decent. It was for a night shift, so that usually pays a bit more anyways. When I went in for the interview, I showed up almost half an hour early because I wanted to make a good impression. The place was quiet, and the waiting area was a tiny, cluttered room near the main entrance. I sat there for what felt like forever, checking my phone for the time. It wasn't until nearly an hour after the scheduled time that the guy conducting the interview showed up. His name was Red, and I immediately noticed something was off about him. He was young, maybe in his mid-20s, with messy blonde hair and a flushed face. He looked disheveled, like he hadn't slept in a few nights. Then when he spoke, I caught a strong whiff of alcohol. That was when I was sure that he was drunk. Against my better judgment, I went with him for the interview. He asked me a few basic questions, mostly stuff about whether I'd worked nights before or had any experience as a guard. I told him that I had done it before and worked nights a few times. After about 10 minutes of half-hearted questions, he nodded and said,
"You're hired, and you start tomorrow."
I agreed, though I wasn't sure how I felt about the whole thing. A drunk hiring manager wasn't exactly inspiring confidence, but the pay was better than I'd expected, and I figured I could tough it out. On my first night, I realized that the place had an almost eerie feel to it. The warehouse was huge, with towering shelves and narrow aisles that seemed to stretch forever. There were a lot of security cameras, more than I'd ever seen in one place. It felt like every square inch was under surveillance, inside and out. My shifts were mostly quiet and boring. I'd walk the perimeter, check the cameras in the security office, and occasionally sign off on delivery logs. For the first month, nothing unusual happened, but the work was isolating, and I barely saw anyone. Red showed up a few times, always looking like he just rolled out of bed, and I only talked to one of the other guards once. He was finishing his shift when I arrived, and we exchanged a few words before he left. The job wasn't bad, but it wasn't exactly exciting either. But that changed one night when something pretty crazy happened. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and I was doing my usual thing. The warehouse was silent except for the hum of the overhead lights. However, as I walked through one of the back aisles, I noticed something odd. One of the side doors was open by just a crack. It immediately seemed weird to me. All the doors were supposed to be locked at all times, and this was the first time I'd seen one open. I approached cautiously, shining my flashlight at the door. Then when I got closer, I saw why it hadn't shut properly. There was a small piece of wood wedged into the frame, preventing the lock from clicking into place. Someone had done this on purpose. I kicked the piece of wood out and shut the door, making sure it was locked this time. As soon as I did, I heard a noise behind me. It was faint, but it was definitely there. I froze for a second, trying hard to listen. Then the noise came again, this time from deeper inside the warehouse. Someone else was in there. It was pretty obvious. I decided to head back to the security office to check the cameras. If someone was in the warehouse, I needed to know where they were before I did anything else. I moved quickly, but also tried to stay quiet. When I got to the office, I locked the door behind me and sat down at the desk. The camera feeds showed every part of the warehouse, but it took me a minute to spot the intruder. He was in one of the aisles, and I had a clear shot of him on the camera. He moved from shelf to shelf, looking through boxes and knocking things over. He was of average size and dressed in dark clothes. A ski mask covered his face, but something about the way he moved caught my attention. He was stumbling a bit, like he might be drunk. I kept watching him for a few minutes, trying to figure out what he was doing. He wasn't carrying anything, no weapon, and it didn't look like he was looking for anything specific. Finally, I'd seen enough, so I decided to call the cops. It felt strange making the call. Nothing like this had happened in the time I'd been working there, and I wasn't sure how long it would take for them to arrive. I told them that it wasn't an emergency because I was locked in the security room, and the intruder didn't seem that dangerous. Still, they seemed to take it pretty seriously and sent some officers over right away. When they got there, I stayed in the office, watching the cameras while I waited. The man kept wandering around, and at one point, he tripped over a box and fell hard, but he got back up and kept going. Then the police finally got to him. They brought him out in handcuffs, and that's when I got a good look at him, without the mask. It was red. The police asked me some questions, and I told them everything I knew. Red was charged with attempted robbery, and the company fired him the next day. They hired a new manager, and the job went on like normal. I finished the next month or so at that place, and then moved on. I still don't know what Red's plan was that night, because he would have had to know that I would see him and call the cops. But like I said, he was probably drunk and not thinking straight, so who knows what he might have done. This happened about 10 years ago, right after I moved out of my parents' house. I had planned to move in with my boyfriend at the time, and everything seemed to be set. But a few weeks before the move, we broke up. Even though it was tough, I decided to move out anyway, because I didn't want to backtrack and stay with my parents. I had already told everyone I was moving out, and I didn't want to admit that I was struggling. Without many other options, I rented a room in a shared house for a month. The place wasn't great. It was just a tiny room with a mattress on the floor, but it was cheap. However, my savings were running low, and I knew I needed to find a job quickly. I spent hours every day searching online, applying to anything I thought I could handle. It felt like I was sending out dozens of resumes into the void, and most of the time, I didn't even get a response. But then one afternoon, I saw an ad on Craigslist for a receptionist position at a warehouse. It didn't give many details, but the pay was decent, and I figured it was worth a shot. I emailed them my resume, and to my surprise, I got a response later that day. The email was brief, asking if I could come in for an interview the next morning. I was relieved, and thought that maybe this was finally my chance to catch a break. The warehouse was about 30 minutes outside the city, in an area I wasn't familiar with, but I was able to find it without much trouble. When I got there, the building looked run down. The parking lot had cracks in the pavement, and the windows were dirty. I tried not to judge it too harshly, though. After all, not every company operates out of a shiny office. I walked up to the door a little early and waited. Then after a few minutes, a man came out to greet me. He introduced himself as Donnie, and right away, I felt strange. He wasn't exactly professional looking. He was wearing a stained white t-shirt that didn't quite cover his stomach, which stuck out prominently. His jeans were baggy and looked like they hadn't been washed in a while. He had a thick mustache, but no other hair on his head. Donnie led me inside, and the place was chaotic. The hallways were narrow, and there were boxes and equipment stacked everywhere. It felt like a maze. I tried to remember the turns we took on the way in, but everything looked the same. Eventually, we reached a small office with mismatched furniture and papers scattered across the desk. I sat down at a folding chair, and Donnie sat across from me. The interview started off fairly normal. Donnie asked about my previous jobs and why I was interested in the position. I answered as best I could, trying to focus on the questions and not the disorganized room or his appearance. But then his questions started to get personal.
So, you got a boyfriend?
He asked, leaning back in his chair. That doesn't really seem relevant, I said, trying to keep my tone polite. Just curious, he said, grinning. Then he asked,
What do you like to do for fun?
I felt my face get hot with nerves. This wasn't the kind of conversation I expected during an interview, so I tried to steer things back to the job and asked more about the position. However, he didn't seem interested in answering. Instead, he leaned forward and said,
"You should come out for drinks with me sometime."
I didn't know how to respond at first, but finally I said, "I don't think that's appropriate." His expression changed after that. The grin disappeared, and his tone became curt.
"Well, that's fine. I think we're done here,"
he said, standing up. I stood up too, relieved the interview was over, but I also felt rattled. "Thank you for your time," I said, trying to sound calm. Donnie didn't respond. He just sat back down at his desk and started shuffling papers around, ignoring me completely. I took that as my cue to leave. I walked back the way I thought we'd come in, but after a few turns, I realized I had no idea where I was. The hallways all looked the same, and there were no signs or markers to guide me. I tried to retrace my steps, but the clutter made it hard to tell if I was going the right way. After a few minutes, I started to panic a little. The warehouse was eerily quiet, and I didn't see a single other person. I called out once, hoping someone might hear me and point me in the right direction, but there was no answer. Then at some point, I turned a corner, and Donnie was standing in the middle of the hallway. He was blocking it right down the middle, and he was staring at me. "Oh, sorry," I said quickly. "I got a little lost. Could you point me to the exit?" He didn't say anything at first, just kept staring. Then he said,
"You shouldn't be wandering around."
I nodded and backed away, turning down another hallway. I walked quickly, and I didn't dare look back. When I thought I was far enough away, I started running. I didn't care if I looked ridiculous, I just wanted to get out of there. I took turn after turn, hoping one of them would lead me to the entrance. Finally, I saw the door to the parking lot, so I ran outside and didn't stop until I was in my car with the doors locked. I sat there for a few minutes, catching my breath and trying to calm down from what had just happened. I knew I wasn't going to follow up with that company. Whatever that job was, it wasn't worth it. The next day, I kept thinking about the whole experience, and I didn't want anyone else to go through what I did, so I decided to post a warning on Craigslist. I wrote about the interview, describing everything that happened in detail. I didn't embellish or exaggerate at all. I just wanted to let people know what kind of place it was. A couple of days later, I got an email from someone claiming to be from the company. They told me to take the post down, saying it was unfair and damaging. I ignored the message because I knew what I wrote was true, and I didn't see why I should take it back. Thankfully, they never followed up with any legal threats or anything like that. I kept looking for jobs, and eventually found one at an office downtown. Some people told me that I should have called the police, but I really don't think anything illegal happened. Fortunately, it never got to that. In 2004, I got a job at a well-known publishing house. I was 38 at the time, newly divorced, and trying to rebuild my life. My resume wasn't remarkable, but I had solid proofreading experience and a college degree. I was just an editorial assistant, but the salary was decent, and the benefits were better than I'd had before. It seemed like the kind of place where I could start fresh, and maybe even grow professionally. My boss, Diane, was in her early 50s, and had a reputation for being a perfectionist. I'd heard from others that she could be difficult, but I figured I could handle her. I needed the job, and I was willing to work hard. At first, Diane seemed professional, if a bit cold. She'd assign tasks, and she expected immediate results. I told myself that her high standards would help me grow, but it didn't take long for me to realize that her approach wasn't about fostering improvement, it was about control. Diane's feedback wasn't constructive, it was cutting. She'd mark up my reports with exaggerated red ink, leaving notes like, "Did you even read this?" During team meetings, she'd single me out for criticism and make disrespectful comments about my lack of attention to detail. Once, she went on for 5 minutes about a typo I'd missed in a draft, ending with, "If this is your best, we're in trouble." It was humiliating. The worst part was her timing. Diane would assign tasks late in the day and expect them finished by morning. One Friday, just as I was packing up, she handed me a 300-page manuscript. "I need this proofread by Monday," she said. I ended up working through the weekend and even canceled plans with my sister to meet the deadline. On Monday, she barely glanced at my work before laying into me. It was like nothing I did could ever be good enough. One evening, Diane asked me to stay late to do some work for a new client. She said it was urgent and wanted it done by the next morning. I worked in the empty office until nearly midnight, in order to get it done. The manuscript wasn't long, but the content was dense, and I had to triple check everything. By the time I left, I was exhausted. I left the file on her desk and emailed her the digital copy before heading home. I thought I'd finally done something that might earn me a little praise, or at least a break from her constant criticism. The next morning, I arrived early, expecting Diane to at least acknowledge the work I'd done. Instead, she stormed into my cubicle at 9:05, waving an empty folder. "Where's the manuscript?" she demanded. I was stunned. "I left it on your desk last night," I said, "and I emailed you the file." She turned her eyes down at me and shouted, "There's no email and no file. Are you seriously trying to tell me you did the work?" I opened my sent folder, but the email was gone. I checked the shared drive where I'd saved the file, and that was empty too. I'd been meticulous about saving everything, and I knew I'd sent that email. Diane stood there, arms crossed, watching as I flailed. "This is unacceptable," she said. "If you can't handle deadlines, maybe this isn't the right place for you." Then she walked off, leaving me feeling humiliated and confused because I couldn't figure out what had happened. I replayed the steps in my head over and over, but nothing made sense. Later that week, I overheard a conversation between two IT staff members. They were talking about unusual activity on the server. Files were disappearing, and emails were being deleted. I didn't think much of it at first, but then it clicked. I started paying closer attention, and noticed that Diane often hovered near my desk when I stepped away. One afternoon, I left for a quick coffee break and returned to find my computer logged out. When I logged back in, a draft email I'd been working on was missing. I confronted Diane that same day. I waited until everyone had left, then I knocked on her office door. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" I asked. She gestured for me to sit. "What is it?" "I know you've been tampering with my computer," I said. "Emails and files don't just vanish. I don't know why you're doing this, but it needs to stop." Her expression didn't change. She leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Be careful what you accuse people of," she said. "Things could get messy for you." Then I stood up and left her office. I knew I was right, but I also knew I couldn't prove it. Diane was careful, and without evidence, it was her word against mine. I started keeping backups of everything on a personal flash drive, but the damage to my confidence was already done. That evening, as I was leaving work, my car wouldn't start. I'd parked in the lot behind the office, and it was already dark. I tried the ignition a few times, but nothing happened. Then I called AAA and waited by the car. A mechanic arrived about half an hour later. After a few minutes under the hood, he came back and said, "Someone cut a wire here. Looks intentional." "Are you sure?" I asked. "Yeah, this isn't wear and tear. Could have been done with a pair of wire cutters," the mechanic told me. I didn't say anything, but I couldn't ignore the thought that it was Diane. The timing was too convenient. She'd threatened me earlier that day, and now my car was sabotaged. I couldn't afford to quit the job right away, so I stayed for a while longer. Over the next year, I worked under Diane as usual. I kept to myself as much as possible, and avoided her unless absolutely necessary. I never confronted her again, and she didn't escalate things further, but the tension never went away. Every day felt like a battle to protect my work and my reputation. In 2006, I finally found a new job and handed in my notice. Leaving that place was one of the most liberating moments of my life. To this day, I can't prove Diane sabotaged my car, but I'll never forget the fear of wondering what she might do next. I've worked in several offices since then, but I've never met anyone quite like Diane, and I hope I never do.